Hey everyone, someone asked me a fantastic question, which is if I am constantly buying Bitcoin every week or on a regular basis, but I'm also spending Bitcoin with the Coinbase Debit card, which is what I do for 100% of my expenses, then isn't it true that sometimes in a spike of high market prices, I'm buying Bitcoin, and then in close proximity, I am spending Bitcoin that is at a price that is lower than that? So, for example, let's say it spikes up to $103,000 per coin right now. Hold on, my dog really wants to be petted here. It spikes up to $103,000 per coin. Then next week it's like say $97,000 per coin, and I'm spending, if I buy Bitcoin this week for 103, but then I'm spending it next week for 97, then how am I not spending $103,000 Bitcoin at 97? The answer is, for tax purposes, that is how Coinbase is going to account for it. But in the long run, it all comes out in the wash and it doesn't matter. So let me give you an example. So let's say you start by buying $10,000 of Bitcoin. You wait until your Bitcoin is valued at $15,000, which is 50% more. And then you start buying Bitcoin with every week and also spending Bitcoin. That's, some of that Bitcoin that you bought that's up 50%. So what's going to happen is over time, there's essentially a lag period because you're buying the Bitcoin first and you're spending it later. Now that later may be days, it may be weeks, or it may be with the initial Bitcoin you bought, months or even years. But it all comes out in the wash because as an asset, Bitcoin is going more up than it's going down, which means, yes, from a tax perspective, if I buy Bitcoin this week on a recurring purchase for 103,000, and then it dips and I'm spending it at 97,000, for tax purposes, Coinbase is going to harvest that tax loss, or any crypto or Bitcoin platform is going to harvest that tax loss, meaning it's always going to, for tax purposes, account for spending the most expensive Bitcoin you have ever bought up to that point. But a better way to look at it is to assume so for tax purposes, it's always what's called HIFO, highest in, first out. But the best way to think about it from a sort of what's really happening is first in, first out, which is to always assume you're spending the oldest Bitcoin that you bought. Because if you think about it, again, if Bitcoin's up, let's call it's up 50% of the time, down 50% of the time versus a week ago or 2 weeks ago. Now, when it's up more than when it's down, which is why Bitcoin is so radically higher now than in the past, because if it's up about half the time and down about half the time, you would think, well, then overall it's flat. But that's not the way it works. When it's up 5%. When it's down 3%, something like that. I'm just making up those numbers. But the short take is it's more up than down. So even though from week to week, the probability that it'll be up versus down is probably 50-50, when you're in an up week, you're in a more of an up week than when you're in a down week, you're in a down week. So over time, even if you started this process and over time, you waited for that very first purchase to be up 20% or 25%, or enough that it's going to stay up and you don't have to monitor it on a daily basis, then on a rolling basis, what's going to happen is you can think about it as I'm always spending the oldest Bitcoin, and so I'm always adding to the top of the stack, and I'm always spending from the bottom of the stack. Which again, I know because of tax purposes, because it's going to do highest in, first out accounting, it feels like, yeah, but wait, that means I'm spending my most expensive Bitcoin. But again, if you're always buying and always selling, and your total Bitcoin stack is getting larger over time, either because you're buying Bitcoin faster than you're spending Bitcoin, or because your Bitcoin is appreciating faster than you're spending it, then you end up way ahead. So, for example, as I've shared, quite a few times, me and Rachel have been living for free for the last 2.5 years. So for 2.5 years, we've been living completely for free. So what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is back in the fall of 2022, Bitcoin was really low, down in between 16,000 and 17,000 per coin. And I was desperately trying to come up with any possible reason to buy more Bitcoin. I mean, any reason to buy more Bitcoin. And I had the bright idea, I talked to Rachel about this, of, hey, let's take our debit cards and rather than just spend money from a bank account that was sitting there, or, peel off money from retirement funds or whatever. Let's proactively front load by buying Bitcoin 18 months of living expenses. So we did that. I have a Coinbase debit card. She has a Coinbase debit card. Anyway, we front loaded on each of those debit cards, what was effectively 18 months of living expenses for that debit card. So in total, it was the total debit card expenditures by our family for 18 months. It just happened to be split, half and half, because she's got a debit card, I've got a debit card, and we both buy stuff for our family. So the combined total of the Bitcoin that ended up on my debit card and her debit card for Coinbase debit card, the combined total of that was about 18 months of living expenses. So from that, we waited, at that point, we only had to wait like a month or two until it was, Bitcoin was like 20,000 a coin, and we bought it like 16, 17, so it was, up significantly by whatever it is, 20% or 25% or whatever. And so after a month or two, we started spending it, and both started using the Coinbase debit cards exclusively as our only spending. So essentially 100% of our of anything we spend money on that would go on a debit card or credit card goes on Coinbase debit cards. Now, there's a few things that don't. For example, expensive international airline tickets do not go on there because it has a $2,500 per day limit. And so, international flights for a whole family of 6 cost more than $2,500. And so we end up putting those on a credit card and paying it back with Bitcoin, with appreciated Bitcoin, which works the same way. But for the debit cards, I track those debit cards, with the original balance. Now, the entire time that I've been spending Bitcoin over the last 2.5 years, I've also been converting every single paycheck into Bitcoin. Literally every paycheck, immediately it hits the bank account, and I immediately buy Bitcoin with it. And so, per the beginning of this video, the question, which is, doesn't that mean that sometimes my paycheck hits, Bitcoin's at 103,000, it hits, and then I'm immediately spending with my Coinbase debit card, even if it drops down? Yes, but again, the way I think about it is I'm spending the first in, first out, not highest in, first out. Now, if you want, this is not good for tax purposes, I do not recommend this, but if you want, and it just helps you feel better about it, you can flip Coinbase to first in, first out, FIFO. All you have to do is go in the tax interface, and it will say, how do you want to account for your Bitcoin? You can do highest in, first out, you can do first in, first out, or you can do what's called LIFO, last in, first out. So the question every time you spend is, are you spending the very oldest Bitcoin, which is first in, first out? Are you spending the highest price Bitcoin, which is highest in, first out? Or are you spending the most recent Bitcoin you bought, which you would never want to do, which is first in, or last in, sorry, LAFO, last in, LIFO, LIFO, last in, first out. So nobody picks last in, first out, LIFO, because that makes no sense. You would never want to do LIFO, because why would you always want to be spending your most recent Bitcoin? I just, if you're going for a tax optimization, you're doing highest in, first out. And if you psychologically want to always be spending your oldest Bitcoin, which should be your most appreciated Bitcoin, then you can set it for first in, first out. Now, the right thing to do is to leave the defaults, which is by default it's set to highest in, first out. The best thing to do is just to leave it highest in, first out, and then, but psychologically account for it as, first in, first out. So I am always buying Bitcoin. Literally every 2 weeks, I buy more Bitcoin with the money that hit my bank account from my paycheck. I buy more Bitcoin. And I'm always spending Bitcoin because I use the Coinbase debit card for basically everything that costs less than $2,500, which is the vast majority of everything I spend. So as a result of that, I am in the exact same sort of psychological predicament as the person asking this question, which is, how do I not feel like I'm spending Bitcoin when it's down? And the answer is because over time, it all comes out in the wash. Over time, Bitcoin, when it's up, is more up than down when it's down. And so over time, the Bitcoin stack, in our case, we started with 18 months of living expenses, combined across 2 debit cards. And now, combined across 2 debit cards, we have 3 years of living expenses. So starting with 18 months, 1.5 years. Then we live 2.5 years, which means we should have run out of money a whole year ago. But we didn't. Instead of running out of money a whole year ago, obviously we wouldn't have run out because, I keep buying more Bitcoin and I have a paycheck. But for those 2 debit cards, I don't count any of the new purchases as supporting our lifestyle. All of that money gets, swept into cold storage and, all of that, along with most of the balances of those cards anyway. So anyway, as a result of that, the math I'm sharing with you, it assumes we had never bought any more Bitcoin from the end of from the fourth quarter of 2022. The truth is we bought a ton more Bitcoin since the fourth quarter of 2022. But for tracking of those debit cards, I'm assuming as though we did not buy any more. So even if you account for it as though we did not buy any more from that 18 months, from there, we've lived for 2.5 years on that 18 months, which means we got a whole bonus year. And now the combined balances of that original Bitcoin, which again is, some of it sits on Coinbase so that the debit cards always work. And most of it is in cold storage, hard to get to, super secure. That's the way we keep our Bitcoin. It's even hard for us to get to. It's a long process. If I want to move large amounts of Bitcoin around, I have purposefully set it up to be a royal headache, even for me. And it's more secure that way. Anyway, but now we have 3 years of runway. So that original Bitcoin we bought in the fall of 2022, at the time was worth 18 months of living expenses spread across 2 debit cards. 2.5 years has now gone by, and now the Bitcoin is worth more than 3 years of runway. We're certainly not going to liquidate it to US dollar cash, but if we did, then 18 months of living expenses would have lasted for 5.5 years. So 18 months turns into 5.5 years, which basically means we get an extra bonus 4 years. It's like 4 years of living for free. Now, the truth is we're not going to liquidate that Bitcoin to US dollars because I think these 2 debit cards will support our family for the rest of our lives. I honestly think that the Bitcoin that's on each of these debit cards, which again, most of it is locked up in very secure ways, but there's a big enough balance that stays on Coinbase so that the debit cards we never swipe the card and then there's no balance there. We keep enough of a balance in Coinbase that the debit cards work. But that original Bitcoin, I think there's a good chance that the Bitcoin we bought in the fall of 2022, that 18 months will support us for the rest of our lives. I mean, honestly, I think at this point we have 2 evergreen debit cards, which is 2 debit cards that will continue to work for standard run rate, lifestyle expenses, all of the things you would normally put on a debit card or a credit card that cost less than $2,500. And I think this will just last for the rest of our lives. But anyway, again, psychologically, I think about it as I'm spending the oldest Bitcoin. But for tax purposes, I'm constantly buying new Bitcoin. And since I'm buying the new Bitcoin on Coinbase and the working balance for those debit cards is also on Coinbase, it's mixing them together. And for tax purposes, it's always going to do highest in, first out for tax purposes. So I know that's a super long explanation, but you sort of have to mentally bifurcate how is it handling it for tax purposes versus how do you think about it for spending purposes. And I don't have a better way of doing it than saying that's just what you got to do. And if you bought a lump sum of Bitcoin and then you bought Bitcoin every 2 weeks with your paycheck and spent it with the debit card, you're going to constantly be running into this where you feel like, but wait, my paycheck hit when it was 103 and now I'm spending it when it's 97. And it's like, yeah, but 2 weeks from now, your paycheck's going to hit when it's 97 and you're going to be spending it when it's 109. So it's like, and you can't time it. It's not like when your paycheck hits, you can say, ooh, but if it's high when my paycheck hits, then I'll just spend the US dollars. But if it's low when my paycheck hits, I'll buy Bitcoin because you don't know. So here's a good example. Rachel's in graduate school at Georgetown University, and there's tuition payments. And the next tuition payment is due on May 16. So back when I first got the notice, which was like 30 days before that the tuition payment was due, Bitcoin had climbed from 76,000 per coin to 86,000 per coin. So, if I was thinking, so again, if your mental model is, I'm not going to buy Bitcoin when it feels high, then you would not have bought Bitcoin for 86,000. You would have liquidated it and paid the tuition payment. But I didn't do that. The tuition payment is not due until May 16, and I'm not going to pay it till May 15. But I was thinking, the thought crossed my mind, wow, we've gone from 74,000 a coin to 86,000 a coin. Should I just go ahead and pay this? And I'm like, no, because that's not the way I work. There's no way I know if 86 is high or low. It feels high because we're coming off of 74 or something, but we're at 86. But I got another month to go till this thing is actually due. So I waited, and 86 turned into 92. And I thought, wow, now I don't want to be greedy here. It's at 92,000 a coin. I considered liquidating the Bitcoin to pay this tuition payment at 86. Now it's at 92. It feels high. Now it's like really feeling high because it hasn't been 92 for like a month or two. And, but I thought, you know what? Nope, I don't do that. I don't time the market. I can't tell what high is. I can't tell what low is. I don't know. You don't know. I don't know. What I do know is that it's always made sense to buy as much Bitcoin as I can and hold on to it as long as possible. So here we are, Bitcoin sitting at 103,000, 103. Now, right now, 103 feels high, but I'm not going to liquidate that Bitcoin and pay that tuition payment until a day or two before it's actually due. Just enough time for it to clear bank accounts and wire transfer and all that sort of stuff. Because, again, we could be sitting here with buying Bitcoin at or liquidating it at 103, and maybe by the time it's due at the end of this coming week, it'll be 116. I don't know. But yeah, so sometimes the saying goes in the stock market, the broader stock market, the saying goes that the stock market takes the escalator on the way up and the elevator on the way down. Escalator meaning the stock market tends to climb slowly and then crash quickly. Bitcoin tends to do the reverse. If it's grinding lower, it tends to grind lower slowly, but then it tends to ratchet. When it grows, it tends to grow very quickly, very fast. And so if you have bought a lump sum of Bitcoin and, sure, you may go a week or two or three where you're like, I keep feeling like I buy Bitcoin and then I'm spending it when it's down. And again, I wouldn't start that way. I would start by buying a lump sum, waiting for it to be up at least 20 or 25% before I started spending any of it, which is what we did. But anyway, if it feels like it's grinding down, when it feels low, you can always, go back and buy buy extra Bitcoin. So maybe it grinds down and you're like, wow, 2 or 3 weeks in a row, I've bought Bitcoin and it seems like by the time I'm spending it, it's lower. Well, great. At some point, buy another lump sum to sort of buy back those lows. And then, at some point, your paycheck will hit and we'll go through a rise like we have the last week or two, where suddenly Bitcoin goes from, the 80,000s to above 100. And it's like, great. It all comes out in the wash, and that those gains are going to far, far, far offset the losses. But again, regardless of how you're doing it, you got to start, if you want to spend Bitcoin with the Coinbase debit card, you got to start with a lump sum and wait long enough that lump sum is up, or that your total Bitcoin holdings is up, 20, 25% minimum before you start spending it. And then after that, like in my case, Bitcoin is up. I have enough Bitcoin that is up enough that I totally don't mind just buying it every time I have money and spending it every time I have a need, because I know it all comes out in the wash, and I know on net I'm ending up ahead. So, and over time I'm ending up like radically, insanely, super far, ridiculously ahead, which is living for literal free for 2.5 years. I mean, for free. There's no other strategy I could have effectuated in the fall of 2022 that would result in us taking 18 months of living expenses, living for free for 2.5 years, and still having more than 3 years of those living expenses left over. Nothing else could have done that. I'm not aware of any other strategy that would have resulted in living for free for 2.5 years and still having 3 years more to go. It's actually more than 3 years. I just haven't calculated it, but it's more than 3 years. And all starting with just 18 months of living expenses. And again, you could do the same with $10. It's just you're going to buy yourself a free cup of coffee, once a quarter. And obviously, it's a lot more compelling to live a lot more of your life for free than just one cup of coffee once a quarter. So anyway, hope all that helps. I know the difference between highest in, first out accounting versus first in, first out psychological accounting is complicated. It's nuanced, but that's just sort of how I think about it. It served me well. Hopefully that makes sense. Hit me with any more questions, anyone who's got them. Thanks, everyone.